So consent, as we've said, as people have said a billion times, is a process, and it's a process of education, right? The informed part is a process of education, people sitting and talking to each other and answering questions and trying to clearly explain people in language that they can understand. That sort of process is something that physicians have very little practice of doing, that mostly that's not what they are trained to do and not what they care about doing. Consent forms are supposed to document that went on. So a consent form could say something like, yes, we had this discussion. That would be a document. When I first started out a billion years ago doing this, Mass General Hospital did not have consent forms for anything, for therapies, that doctors wrote notes in the hospital record saying, I spoke to Mrs. Jones and we discussed the following things, which is what you would expect. So hospitals have come to love forms of all sorts. People have come to love forms of all sorts. Everybody, and if you think about how many forms you look at and sign, away on a regular basis, you realize how useless they've become. So that, there's not a person who has iTunes who's actually read the iTunes contract, and it's not there in order for people to read. It's there to protect iTunes, and the car rental contracts are there to protect the car rental agencies, and that's what forms have become, and that's what consent forms have become. So the other day in my IRB, I actually saw a 36-page consent form to something which wasn't particularly complicated at all. And so there were a couple of things. One is that no one reads anymore. No one reads certainly more than a paragraph. If it doesn't fit in 140 characters, or if it doesn't fit on a screen before you have to scroll down, you won't read it. And the thought that anyone will actually read these forms is ridiculous. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that the length, and the other is that they're entirely uninformative, that they're just a data dump and don't at all respond to what people are interested in and need to know. So forms that list all the risks of drugs, and they do that now, drug by drug, are not informative. It just tells you everything that could happen to a human being, whether it's likely to happen, might happen, or is a serious problem. They don't say. And it entirely ignores even the federal rules that say the reasonably foreseeable risk should be disclosed. Not every risk, but we disclose every risk, which is like disclosing no risks. So this is like an old lawyer's trick of saying, all the I want all the files you have about Joan Racklin. And what I do is I find every possible file, scrap of paper, I put it in a van and I dump it. I say, here they are, you figure it out. And that's what informed consent forms have turned into. And so everybody hates them. There's like no one who thinks informed consent forms are any good anymore. And people keep poking them and prodding them and trying to edit them. And so the better thing to do is to do away with them entirely, that there should be no consent forms anymore. And the primary reason for that is not just because they're useful, but if we actually want documentation of what subjects have been told, there are much better ways of doing it. We have no idea when someone signs on that line what they've been told. What we should do is record the consent process, and it should be audio recorded. It's really easy to do. It's really cheap to do now. It means that the people who get others' informed consent will have to consider the fact that someone may actually listen to this at some point. It doesn't mean that the IRB has to listen to each one of those, but they should do it sort of randomly, and people should know that the stuff is monitored, and if there's ever a question, we would have it. But it would force people to think about their conversation, knowing that they're recorded and what's important, and listen to the responses. So this is a problem with having regulations that are as old as they are, that there was no such thing as a digital tape recorder back then. The only way things were documented were with paper. Things are hardly documented with paper. Paper, the idea is that for paper to stop existing, but the regs actually require written informed consent. And that has to change. What the regs should require is documentation, but that doesn't have anything to do with writing anymore.